Wang Shangjai called chopping fist Pichuan in Yiquan silent sweep of the bell. So if you think about a bell and the way that a bell moves, like a big church bell or something like that, without a sound, but it carries that immense weight, it's trying to get that idea across. And this technique is entirely different to the Pichuan in Xingyichuan. And if you don't believe that, that's a direct quote from Wang Shangjai in his book Breaking Hands. And he always describes these techniques in reference to specific things that might occur in a fight, so specific kinds of attacks. So you've got to pick out from that the generalizations that he's talking about. And also in this section, he has a little bit of a sexist thing where he's going on about quarrelling women, scratching faces. We'll not include that today, except to say that he's absolutely not against the technique of scratching faces. So he makes a point of saying he's quite happy to learn from quarrelling women the technique of scratching faces. Whatever works, and that's where he says that a chamber pot is just as valuable as a Ming vase in a crisis. But let's pick out from his description the critical thing that explains the posture as we're looking at it here. So Wang Shangjai says, as your left hand rises and left foot steps out, your entire body turns rightward with a twisting, swaying motion generated from the waist and spine. This rotational power flows through your left arm and to the opponent's body, forcing them to lose their foundation and breath. As I've said before, it's an element of negative lineage and emergence that over the decades Yiquan postures have got more compact, so it's entirely likely that I'm doing this posture much smaller than Wang Shangjai would have done it. But what matters is to understand the essential elements. So as you step forward and the left hand lifts up, at that point the right shoulder is going back, so the body is turning to the right as the hand lifts out, and you create this kind of circular motion. And the idea is that the edge of the hand articulates in, and it's like if you imagine the edge of a bell that's swinging and that edge hits into the opponent. So Wang Shangjai says, and I quote, the edges of both hands should be like sharp knives, and your power should be as silent as the sweeping of a bell. In practicing this, also comprehend how to apply power. When countering the opponent's attack, your intent should involve concealing, inhaling and exhaling, drawing in their force to make it fall short. Nullify its effect. When you strike, it must be precise, yet the timing should be unexpected. Strike high when they are high and low when they are low. In summary, engage power when contact is made. Maintain a consistent flow without pause. Your body and the point of contact with the opponent should remain tight but not static. Your explosive power kept in readiness, even as your opponent's body moves away. The power is retracted and stored. This is the subtlety of distributed force. Okay, let's break it down and look at some specifics, beginning with articulated force. And you'll remember that the whole point at the beginning of this exercise was to compensate for the loss of oppositional force by emphasizing the quintessence principle of articulated movement. Only now the articulation seems a lot less than when we started, when we introduced the concept. And this is because we started with a version that was, broadly speaking, similar to Xingyichuan. And of course, in Xingyichuan, for standard Pichuan, you start with this posture with your palm down, and then as it comes through, it lifts to palm up, and then it articulates back into the strike. And remember, we talked about the idea of a rotational movement in a straight posture in Xingyichuan. One of the reasons you can get that rotation is the articulation of the wrist in this particular kind of posture where you've got massive rotation of the hand anyway, just because of the start point. And as I said in the beginner series, this is why you start with your postures at the side in traditional wushu, so you can get this articulation and screwing force onto every posture. But each one reverses this and uses a rounded structure with linear force, and that also means that the posture starts from a different hand position in this case, like we're holding the bottom of a bell. And that causes a lot of force to be lost because we've lost that big run up in the Xingyichuan version, we've lost some of the articulation. And you can compensate for that to some degree by using Hunyuan posture, so the expansion of the rounded posture. But the instinct then is to compensate for the loss of force by really going with that. So using much more oppositional force, making it a really big oppositional force posture, which is probably what Wang Shangjai is talking about in that quote that I gave earlier. Because in the 1940s and 1950s, the attitude was very much that in a real fight you should just hit as hard as you possibly could 1 or 2 times to try and finish the fight. And you still hear people talking like that these days in terms of Yiquan, because it's not necessarily a terrible self-defense idea. And to be fair, it probably was enough to beat a lot of people in China in the 1940s, 1950s, people who weren't used to heavy contact. But certainly by the 1980s, and certainly amongst Yao Zongzun's group, the attitude had changed into thinking that in a world of modern martial arts and Western boxing, that was no longer going to be a sufficient approach. And it's part of Yao Zongzun's true genius to start thinking about, well, maybe instead of just relying on full power strikes all the time, because after all, you can develop that and you've always got that weapon, but also then improving your cultivation so that you can use combinations much more efficiently, and relying on the combination to get the posture in for the big power shot at the end. And that in each one requires using a much more curtailed movement. And you can see the physical trade-off. If you use a massive amount of oppositional force, you can get a lot of power into the posture, but the next technique, particularly if it's a rear hand strike, it's miles further away, so it makes the combination much clumsier and also much slower. So speed is a weapon in itself, particularly against a skilled opponent. And shorter, curtailed postures give us that advantage. Okay, let's move on to thinking about the footwork. So first of all, this kind of posture where one foot moves forward and the other one follows on behind, that's called leading step, because one foot is stepping out and leading the posture. And you'll remember from the beginner series that when we do that with a flat foot straight forward, that's called seeking step, and that refers to the position of the foot rather than the step itself. The step itself is called leading step. But look carefully at the feet and you'll see it's a version of seeking step, but it's not a flat seeking step where the foot just goes straight out forward. It's kind of landing in a pivot route, so the seeking step has been skewed. And we do that to allow us to use a rotational movement. So the foot goes like, it doesn't land just dead straight, it lands slightly on an angle. You've got to get it just right. It can't be too much or the ankle can go over. But it's just slightly on the side like that, and that allows you to do, well, what I was demonstrating there is it's the same principle as in empty step in traditional wushu. So it has that kind of curl in like that. And I want you to look at that again very carefully. Note the lead foot. The first one lands okay, but the second one slips because I'm training on ground. It's been raining and it's really muddy where I'm training. It's quite hard to control the posture. But this is why we do these postures like this. Remember, I talked about this in the beginner series. We land with the toe and then we slide down on the heel. So if there's a catastrophe, we can rescue it. But if you step in a way that puts the heel down first and you slip, it's incredibly difficult to rescue it and you can easily injure yourself or just slip right over. And that is one of the problems with how Xing Yiquan sets postures, which I can demonstrate because I was doing something else a little bit later and I did a Xing Yiquan style set and I slipped. And I couldn't rescue it, it took me right off my route. And you can compare that with the toe first landing that I do at the end here, where I slip and I rescue it easy. And although they might seem similar to a cursory glance, the Xing Yiquan step always lands with the weight on the heel. And the reason for that is so that you can harmonise the landing of the heel with the lock point, i.e. the point where you maximise the transmission of force, so you solidify the posture and you hope that you time that perfectly with hitting the opponent. And in Xing Yiquan, where you time the hitting of the heel into the floor with the lock point, i.e. the strike, that's called a harmony. And there's more to Xing Yiquan harmonies than that, but in that particular case, according to Yiquan theory, the science is correct, but it just becomes a restrictive ideology if the idea, as in Xing Yiquan, is that you should always harmonise those two things. Because there are lots of times when the reality of the context of the fight suggests that different kinds of sets, not sets in the sense of natural set as in a collection, sets as in setting the posture, different kinds of setting are better because they find a better doctrine of the mean, a better balance between different considerations. And one of the really important things that Yiquan learned from Bagua or brought this quintessence principle of Wushu from Bagua is that setting doesn't have to be perfectly harmonized. It can be distributed over more movements. And the ability to intuitively use the right kind of setting for whatever posture it is you're doing within whatever context is very much advanced Yiquan. So that's what I want to explore now and show you a few interesting things around that. So first of all, what matters in a big step like this isn't whether you land with the ball of the foot first, it's where you put the weight. So if you put the weight on the ball of the foot, then the heel drops and the energy of the heel dropping goes down into the floor, as opposed to if you step, even if you step lightly with the ball of the foot, but then all of your weight lands on the heel, that pushes the energy of the heel forward, and that's what makes you slip. Even for normal walking, that's what makes people very often slip. So we're using this version of seeking step where you turn the foot in slightly, land on the ball of the foot, and then the heel doesn't just drop down, it straightens up as it lands. So the foot lands on an angle and then the heel goes straight down. So if you look at my hand, that's the angle that the foot lands on, onto the ball of the foot, and then the energy goes down into the heel. It goes down into the floor rather than pushing the heel out forward, which is natural. If you think about it, if you're taking a step forwards, the heel is going forwards when it lands, so that's why it slips. However, remember that the genius of Yiquan is in the way that everything is structurally sympathetic to everything else, the way that it's all interconnected like Lego bricks. So we don't just do this step because it's better for landing, and we don't always do it anyway, as we'll see in a moment. But the reason we do it in the first place isn't because it helps us land the posture better, it's because it helps us maximise oppositional force. And that's simply because as you step and you open your arms, as you hit out with the left hand, if you turn to the right, as Wang Xiangjia explains it, then that just lets you open more. It helps you maximise open. So you tip your leg over with the pivot roots, not because it's some arbitrary decision from a cultural set, but because it allows you to maximise that posture. It allows you to make that posture bigger, faster, more easily, and anyone can experience that just by doing it themselves. And don't forget, of course, that according to Yiquan theory, a rounded posture is more in harmony with the laws of physics. It maximises force better, hence Hun Yuan posture rather than the linear postures of Xing Yiquan. It's a big difference with Xing Yiquan. And again, you can experience that yourself by just trying different versions of the posture. In any case, what we need to understand next is that the lock point changes in relation to the set, depending on whether we do a Xing Yiquan style set or an Yiquan style set. And this is all about that other key skill, timing. So you can see there that the Xingyi style set sets on the lead foot, so it's an unorthodox set, and the lock point is timed exactly when the heel hits the floor. So you won't necessarily hit the opponent with the lock point, you just hope to do that because that's the point of maximised transmission of force. But if we play it even slower, you can see that at the lock point, the rear foot is not on the floor, so you're just balanced on the front foot, i.e. you are double weighted. And some postures in Xing Yiquan will have a very sunken stance, which is in part to compensate for being double weighted and being off balance. It's to make you more balanced. But if you're working out how to use Hun Yuan Li with a similar posture and you think, well, I'm going to set the posture in the same way as Xing Yiquan, then you just recreate the problem. So it actually becomes much worse because of the bigger rounded posture, and you can really feel that at the lock point, this is if you set it on the front foot, the front heel, at the lock point, your rear foot will be in the air and you'll lose a lot of the oppositional force. Plus, if someone just caught your arm and pulled you, they could just pull you right off balance. So the solutions begin to suggest themselves naturally. Naturally, the lock point should form as the ball of the lead foot hits the floor. But that also means you've lost the set, so you've not hit your heel onto the floor to solidify the posture. But what we're going to do is we're going to return the set to the orthodox set, which is to set it on the rear foot for a lead hand posture in most cases. That is, remember, it sets on both feet, but it's what we call the dominant set, the point where there's the most and hardest contact with the floor. That's what gives you what Wang Xiangjia calls rebound energy. It's really just solidifying the posture so you can transmit force. But this is a solution of many parts because even so, even by doing the lock point as the lead foot touches the ground with the ball of the foot, you're doing a step so the rear foot is still in the air. And if there's no lock point, then you can't really transmit the force in the same way. So you lose a massive amount of your force. So how do you solve that problem? And the answer comes from Bagwajang. We use a distributed set, so it's happening over a longer period than a Xingyiquan set. Xingyiquan set happens in a split second. This set is going to happen in like half a second. And our timing here has got to be absolutely immaculate, so that as we hit the lock point, as the ball of the lead foot hits the floor, then instantly the rear heel hits down back into the floor, kind of kickback routing, really solidifies the stance, pushes all the energy forwards, and creates a really hard set. So all the elements of the set are distributed across a broader, more phased time scale. So it's still a harmony in the Xingyiquan sense. It's not a split harmony where we completely separate the set from the strike. It's still a harmony, but it's a distributed harmony. It's distributed over a longer phased movement. When we say longer, when we do it really fast, well, we're just bending the rules. We're doing it so fast that we can bend the rules a little bit, and there's still enough time for the lock point to lock back into the set and transmit that force. Kinetic force. It's not magic force, just kinetic force, and that's why we're doing it like this. But then it gives you this really odd kind of movement, like a kind of Michael Jackson step when you do it on the spot like that. But when we then change it to distribute it across a whole leading step, then it doesn't look quite so silly, and you can feel yourself how it just distributes the set, pushes it across a wider time frame, but there's just enough time to get the power into the lock point as it sets back into the rear foot. The genius of Yiquan, and that's really only touching the very tip of what's possible with setting postures.